all of those creators. And on the other hand, we're working with a large group of ad agencies and brands that buy ads out of their in-house. So they have their own team of buyers that represent their brand, and they're seeking out content, always trying to find the most authentic, organic brand fits and podcasts that really make sense for the brands. For instance, if you're listening to a health and wellness podcast, you're going to hear more ads with clients like Athletic Greens or just really health and wellness focused brands, BetterHelp, Calm, Talkspace, really self-improvement focused brands, rather than on like Joe Rogan, for instance. You're going to hear kind of more rougher type clients. We identify podcasters' target audience demographics before we take an approach to the marketplace, whether a show is male skewing or female skewing, or whether their primary audience is in the 18 to 24-year-old range or the 55 plus range. All of that matters so much when you're looking for client base and when you're looking where to find budgets. So my company really identifies target audiences, really learns the content. We learn a lot about what our podcast, what their goal is, what kind of clients they want to work with, and who's listening. And from there, we target our sales approach by going to those agencies that rep those brands and buy for those brands, or we go to the brands directly and get the budgets from them. So that's kind of an upper level view at what we do. We're podcast ad reps. We're a monetization rep firm. We don't really produce content. We don't own studios. We're not creating our own shows. We're just meeting and partnering with shows that have their own content that need support on the sales front. So most of the brands in podcast advertising come from kind of a smaller group of ad agencies. They're called DR agencies. And what DR means is direct response. Those are the ad campaigns that have a promo code associated with them. So what a promo code does is it tells a brand how many conversions there are on any given ad. If you listen to the Anthony podcast and I'm promoting BetterHelp on my show, I'm going to say, hey, for 15% off your first 6 months of being on BetterHelp, use the code Anthony at checkout. What the brands do is they evaluate all their performance. They evaluate conversions, and they see if the partnership's really making sense, if they're driving enough conversions to keep spending money and keep that voice going out in the space. Audiences don't always respond to direct response ads. A lot of the times listeners will just hear an ad, and rather than using the promo code, they'll just go to the website and they'll go buy something outside of the ad campaign, which, it's not a perfect system, but the DR system does really help prove out performance and keep podcast ad spend up. A little bit more about podcast advertising. A lot of the times we book campaigns, brands will choose to book shorter term campaigns, like 1 month to 3 months, where they'll book just 1 to 3 spots or 6 spots. And they really it's called a test campaign. They're testing the content to see if the DR conversions are really working, if there's a lot of people spending money. And once they kind of validate their spend and they see that the partnership makes sense, they'll book renewals through end of year. So a lot of the times our campaigns start out with just a 3-month commitment. And then once they can evaluate performance, they either fall off, those campaigns go away, or they're renewed for another year. This industry really works on that annual fiscal year calendar, that 1-year calendar. So at the year's end, ad slates and ad schedules all pretty much reset. So just a little perspective on that. We just got over the year turn, which is kind of a daunting time frame for networks like us, because we really know how much spend commitment there is in any given quarter at the beginning of the year, middle of the year, and towards the end. But once you're at the year's end and you start a new year, you're really just resetting, and you've got to build your budgets around how much spend is on the books in upcoming months. So it's kind of a confusing time, end of year, beginning of year, Q4 and Q1. So yeah, it's a little bit about the DR agencies and how they operate, the direct response agencies. If you're an independent podcaster looking for a place to reach out, you can always choose between representing your own content and trying to monetize on your own, or hiring on an agency like my business, Podcast Ad Reps, or one of our competitors like AdvertiseCast or HeadGum, True Native Media. There's a lot of different rep firms out there that do what we do. They'll simply take a commission percentage, and they don't make money until they're able to be effective for you. They're not going to make money until they book campaigns and start selling media. And then they'll take a commission cut, which usually hovers around 30%. So don't be fooled by the random networks out there that want to ask for 50% or 60% of your ad revenues. Really, anybody out there that's effective and qualified, they're going to be offering more of a 30% revenue split or somewhere around that. So yeah, you can partner with an agency like PAR if you really don't have a feel for sales, or if you don't have a feel for the clientele in the ad space, or you can choose to represent your own content, which I think that's a great thing to do too. If you don't have a lot of commitments, if you have some free time and you really want to go try and make some money out there, you can do it yourself. And if you're effective enough, you're saving 30% of your revenues by doing that. The big DR agencies in the US are Ad Results Media, Veritone One, Oxford Road, Right Side Up. There's a few more ad agencies, but they really represent 200 to 300 clients, and they're the most common clients you'll hear on any of your favorite podcasts, like ShipStation or ZipRecruiter, MeUndies, Third Love. There's just so many brands you hear often. Athletic Greens, BetterHelp. So there's a lot of different routes you can take for monetization. You can represent your own content. You can have a sales network represent your content. You can reach out to brands that work with ad agencies. So you can reach out to those DR agencies that I mentioned, or you can go after the brands directly. You can actually go talk to BetterHelp as a company, and there's people at that business that are going to spend money on podcast ads in-house. So yeah, that's mostly how the podcast ad industry is organized, just kind of on the surface. You've got podcasters on one end, and then you've got brands on the other end. And in between, you've got ad agencies that represent those brands, and you've got podcast networks that represent those shows. It doesn't have to flow like that. It can, you can jump the lines. You could work directly with the ad agency as a podcaster, but that's how this industry is really all organized. If anyone has questions on that, let me know on the end. I've got some creative materials I built for other conversations that might make that look a little bit more simple than it sounds here. Oh yeah. Rob,
oh yeah. Well, I was just going to say, thanks for the great overview of, it's a very, very complicated industry, and a lot of people do think it's as simple as turning on a microphone and then suddenly Spotify is calling you with that $100 million exclusivity deal. So really, really good to have an expectation going in, for what you actually need to do to have it, to achieve what you want. But some of us, maybe aren't looking for the advertising funding. So this is where I'm going to toss it over to Megan. We'll come back around to Anthony and open it up to questions and everything. But Megan, why don't you tell us a little bit about grant funding and more about what you do?
Sure. Thanks, Rob, and lots to chew on, Anthony. So yeah, my name's Megan Torgerson. I produce a podcast called Reframing Rural, and I'm self-employed. So I also am a grant writer, and I have one grant client at the moment because I also do communications consulting for nonprofits. So I wear a lot of different hats, but it enables me to do what I want to do and to produce the podcast ultimately. So my client is Alice Ghosty, and she is a choreographer. And I grant write for her as an individual artist, and then for her performance company, Melicarna. And she is based in both Italy and Seattle. So sometimes it's me translating applications. I don't speak Italian, but she just tells me like what she wants, and I put that into English. And it's a really fun partnership. And I've learned a lot in working with her. And I got my grant start working for Northwest Documentary, a nonprofit in Portland, Oregon. And I was fresh out of creative writing school and was like, hey, what can I do with this? And had a passion for documentary films. And so started writing grants for that nonprofit, and then came back to it years later. And so I write grants right now for Alice, Melicarna, and then Reframing Rural. And my approach with Alice and Melicarna is to basically apply for as many things as we can, because that's a large part of their fundraising stream. So like in 2021, we received 27% of the grants that we applied for, but it's a different approach than how I approach Reframing Rural. I don't have someone paying me to apply for grants for my own project. So I'm really particular. If I feel like I have a good likelihood of earning the grant, winning the grant, then I'll apply. So it's just like a little bit different strategy in how I decide what grants to go after for myself versus for my client. And so I'm based in Seattle, but my podcast is mainly set in Montana. The first grant that I got was from the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture. It's called the Smart Ventures Grant. It was $1,000 and it didn't require a fiscal sponsorship. I could just use I have a business LLC and like use my EIN number to apply for that grant. And that was it's kind of an easier grant for some people to get. You'll notice some statewide humanities councils or county specific or city specific grants are sometimes kind of set up for early stage artists. And it's really helpful when you see some of those opportunities, because when you get one grant, then it really helps to get other people on board. They see the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture supported you. And so, maybe they think that you're worthy in investing in as well. And then I was identifying that a lot of the grants that I wanted to go after were in Montana. And since a lot of my stories were centered in Montana, I approached the Montana History Foundation and asked them to be my fiscal sponsor. And so what a fiscal sponsor is I'm not a nonprofit, I'm a small business. I don't have a 501c3, which a lot of grants require that you apply under a 501c3. I'm also not based in Montana. And so Montana History Foundation provides me a Montana address and a 501c3 to apply for grants in Montana. And as I've found, there's a lot more rural support in Montana as well. And I don't know if any of you live in Minnesota, but Minnesota is just popping off with amazing foundations supporting rural arts and culture. So through Montana History Foundation, I applied for 3 grants last year. 2 of them I received. One of them, the program was super specific and I wasn't exactly meeting the program criteria, but I did win a Humanities Montana grant and a Greater Montana Foundation grant. And some things that I learned in that process, the Greater Montana Foundation grant, that foundation was started by a person in broadcasting from Butte, Montana, who really wanted to support media broadcasting, and so created this foundation. And their big stipulation is that they're hoping that their grant awardees get into commercial radio stations in Montana. And so I approached a bunch of commercial radio stations and I wasn't able to get into any of these radio stations, but somehow through the grant application, and I had an interview with their foundation panel, I convinced them that podcasting was also a way that I was getting to Montana listeners. And that's a big thing that they want, content in front of Montana listeners. And so I also had a position in the grant, basically yes, many of my stories are from Montana, but I also interview rural advocates in Minnesota and in Washington. That's kind of been a primary focus for this season. And so I had to argue to them, what's the benefit of telling rural Minnesota stories for a Montana audience and sharing how they can really learn from people outside of the state as well. And yeah, so I put together also some resources for how to start a grant, grant search. So for instance, Corporation for Public Broadcasting has an RFP alert that you can sign up for. Philanthropy News Digest does too. And you can type in your interest. It could be rural or it could be healthcare or arts or media. So you can hone your kind of search that you wanted to receive from Philanthropy News Digest. And then included some other links to just directories that list a bunch of grants. But you can also look at your statewide humanities council, look at there's re-granting organizations on a county level or on sometimes a regional level within a state. And then look for a statewide foundation directory, the Montana Nonprofit Association posts this Montana Foundation directory. So you can kind of look through all these foundations and see if they have programs that match what you're doing. And yeah, also just like looking at other organizations, like who's providing them with grants. That could be, you know, another podcast that's in your state or another podcast that covers the topics that you're covering. And then I recommend, once you've identified grants that you want to apply for, to have a conversation with the grant program officer first. I've sat on a grant review panel once, and they were, you know, we were asking, like, did these applicants call you and have a conversation? Like, this is relationship building too. Like, they want to know that you're really interested in the foundation. And so it's always good to first call and have a conversation and see if the grant program is a good match for your project. And maybe they have tips and for putting together an application. And also, like, I always attend Zoom like webinars from foundations where they're introducing the application, and sometimes part of it's boring and they're just like walking you through the application, but then they have Q&As at the end and people ask really good questions. And it's just another opportunity to have potentially some FaceTime with the foundation. And then some foundations also like might offer to read an application, or they'll have a phone call with you and you'll go through your questions and you'll go through the application together. So I always take advantage of those opportunities. And in grant writing, you're going to get a lot of no's. So always ask like what feedback that you can receive from them, like maybe any feedback from the panel that sometimes they'll give you that info, sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll, in the denial letter, be like, so many people applied, we don't have capacity to give you feedback. But I always like to ask. And then, yeah, so lately I've been thinking about approaching grant writing a little bit differently. So basically foundations usually have set programs that are like Humanities Montana has a program for documentary films and for podcasts. And then some foundations have discretionary funds, and those are basically funds that they can distribute at their discretion without you going through a formal grant application. And that's not always broadcasted, but that's why I also love having conversations with program officers, because you can like ask them questions about different foundations in the area and they'll give you tips that aren't like listed on a website. But right now I'm kind of thinking, and I'm testing this out right now and like having meetings with different foundations to see if I could approach them about basically sponsoring an episode. So instead of me going through the grant application, maybe AMB West Philanthropies has someone on their board that they think would be really great to have a podcast interview with. So kind of approaching it from that standpoint, where they would basically, I would just say, this episode is supported by AMB West, and then they would provide me a couple of recommendations for someone to interview. And that would be just kind of easier than going through the whole grant application process in a way too. I mean, it is putting it more into the relationship building realm that versus like the grant writing realm. But just to see what kind of opportunities are out there, because not everything is listed. And yeah, I put together a folder with like a grant calendar template. So like how to track like, what the foundation is, what their funding priorities are, and maybe contacts and all of that. And then like a reporting tab that because you have to report on all of the grants that you win. And that can be confusing. And then I have like a list of a bunch of search tools. And I also included like the Humanities Montana grant that I won, if you wanted to like read through what a grant like looks like if you haven't written one yourself. And there's a couple other just tips that I'll mention. Creative Capital has like a nice blog post with grant writing tips. And then Artist Trust is a Washington foundation, and they have posted like a couple artist statements and impact statements from previous awardees. So it's like always so helpful to read through how people are positioning themselves. And yeah, it's really kind of thinking about storytelling, which all of you know how to do. And then also giving the foundation an opportunity to get in front of your audience. So, you can say like, I have 6,000 listeners, and I'll say this episode is sponsored by Humanities Montana, and they'll be introduced to your work. So kind of seeing how you can help them and how they can help you, and positioning it also like, that you need their funding, but the project's going to happen no matter what. Like you need it, but you're not desperate for it. It's kind of this fine line when you're making that ask. And I'll also name in the Humanities Montana grant, if you're really good with budgets, you'll note that my budget numbers are a little off. But my fiscal sponsor was like, it's okay. And we retooled the numbers there. So if you notice that is wrong, it is wrong, because I'm better at storytelling than math. But yeah, those are my tips for you.
Great. And that was a wonderful overview on grant funding. For those, we had a few people that joined us in progress. So just a reminder, this is the Rural Radio Collective's meeting about podcasts, advertising, and funding, grant funding. And I'm Rob Upchurch. I'm here to talk about freelancing now. So I'll talk about freelancing and what I do for about 10 minutes, and then I'll open the floor back up to questions, general discussion. If you have any questions you might want to ask Megan about grant funding or Anthony about advertising, I'm sure they would love to answer them for you. But yes, so I'm Rob Upchurch. I'm a freelance podcast producer. I focus on making podcasts for companies and nonprofits, definitely more on the company side, because believe it or not, those are the ones that have the money to do so. And that's why I target companies, is because, lots of people want to be the next Joe Rogan or Guy Raz or whoever else is famous in podcasting, but they don't have the money to pay someone a wage to get it done professionally. So from a freelancing perspective, what I would say starting out is, one, no one's going to hire you if they don't know that you can do the thing that you claim to do. So it's an unfortunate fact that you probably will have to do a little bit of work for free from the get-go if you're not working for yourself. So Megan can take her podcast, Reframing Rural, and show that she can do that, and hopefully get some freelance clients if she was interested in that. But if you don't have anything to show for it, it's going to be really hard to convince someone to pay you to do the thing that you haven't even proven you can do. From a business perspective, though, one of the most important things, and Megan kind of touched on this, is please, for the love of God, set up an LLC. Now, I'm not an accountant and I'm not an attorney, but please have a business entity for tax purposes at the very least. I know it sounds complicated, and I know it sucks to go out and want to start a business, and the first thing you got to do is pay some lawyer money to go file some paperwork with your state. But honestly, it's going to save you tons of headaches down the line. It's going to make doing taxes easier. It's going to make getting paid easier. It's going to make it so that when you buy a microphone, it's a tax write-off instead of just money out of your pocket. There's a lot of reasons that even if you are one individual, I would highly recommend, if you are going to be doing any sort of freelancing work or contract work, that you establish an LLC. It just makes things that much easier. Following that, I really think it's important for freelancers and people starting out to establish your rates and pricing and be firm with that. You're doing this because at the end of the day, you got to get paid and you have to put food on the table. As fun and cool as media production is, it also takes a lot of labor and knowledge to do it well and to do it properly. And you deserve to be paid for your work. AIR in particular, the Association for Independence in Radio, has some really, really, really great guidelines on how to best determine your freelance rates. But at the end of the day, $50 an hour is not out of the question for a freelance audio professional. That's pretty much a standard rate. Now, some people like to track hours. What I actually like to do is productize. So what this means is, instead of saying that I'm going to charge my client for however many hours I work on their show a month, they come to me with the show, they tell me what they want done, and I come up with a rough estimate of how long that's going to take me, and then I give them a flat rate. I just find that's a lot easier to manage from my end, but you may find it differently. But that's just an idea. So instead of saying that you're going to charge someone X amount of hours, you can just outright tell them it is $150 for an episode of a podcast, or it is $500 or whatever it may be. I think that's actually very helpful to a lot of businesses because it allows them to budget more effectively. And like Anthony was saying, with working on a fiscal year, they can know how much they're investing and paying for their podcast for marketing purposes out of their marketing budget. If you give them that productized flat rate versus saying it costs this much an hour and one episode may take this many hours and one episode may take this many hours. Now, of course, that's going to suck if something comes up and you have to spend 2 extra hours working on it or whatever that might be. But yeah, productizing is definitely where I've found some success with convincing clients to hire me on. And then as far as marketing goes, I personally, you may feel differently, but I've found the most effective thing is to just do your job, do it well. And, you know, those people you work for, when their podcast starts to take off and their friends who also own businesses or work in marketing or whatever it may be, start asking about it, they're able to say, oh, I hired a freelancer for that. And then they point them to you. Similarly, when I am on a sales call with someone, I like to explain to them, this is what I do, and that I will get it done well and be focused on it. And it is better to do it in that way than to have your new guy in the marketing office doing it on Friday afternoon before he gets out. You know, a lot of people think that podcasting is just turning on a microphone and talking, but they don't know all the different technical end of things and how distribution works. And a lot of those things that a more seasoned producer or reporter or anyone who deals with these things day in, day out can be aware of. So I hope that that's kind of given at least a brief overview of freelancing and how you should start to approach it. So kind of to recap, for the love of God, please have an LLC or some form of business entity. Be fair to yourself and get paid for it. And word of mouth and being good at your job is about the best marketing that I've found. So yeah, that's pretty easy coverage of freelancing. It's going to be a lot harder to find freelance clients if you are a rurally focused or rural bound person. I will admit that a lot of my clients are based in cities, and I work with them either remotely or I travel to them. And so that's definitely worth considering. But I think especially in COVID times where everyone is used to remote work, there's a case for even rural people being able to freelance in a, you know, corporate environment where if they have a city within driving distance to them. So I hope that addressed some freelance stuff and wasn't just the ramble that I felt it was. But now I think we'll go ahead and just open it up to questions. I'd rather, you know, hear about what questions you guys have for any of our people. So again, Megan can talk about grant funding and running her own podcast. Anthony can talk about advertising, maybe some thoughts on crowdfunding or you know, Patreon and things like that. But his expertise is really in crowdfunding. But yeah, I'd like to just go ahead and open up the floor. And I will be putting my contact information in the chat right now. So if anyone has questions about freelancing or wants to follow up with me, feel free to do that.
I have a
Do we
question.
just unmute and pipe up? Is that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. I have a quick question for Anthony. Thanks for that background. That was super helpful. I'm just curious if you can maybe shed a little bit more light on what ads cost, both on the brand side and what you might make as a podcast producer.
That's a really good question, and one of my favorite ones to answer. So the ads that we book are mostly priced based on a CPM. So that's cost per mille, and that's a French word for thousand. So dollars per thousand listeners. The industry standard CPM right now is $25. So if your podcast receives 1,000 downloads per episode, the average cost of an ad would be $25. We're working with a lot of podcasts that are around 50,000 downloads. So what you do to determine that average spot cost is you multiply 50, as in 50 thousands, 50 times industry standard $25 CPM. So 50 times 25 is your average spot cost. Most podcasters include about one ad per 15 minutes of content. So if you have a 1 hour podcast, episodes are about an hour in length. You can put up to 4 sponsors in those episodes comfortably. So if you're pulling in around 40,000 downloads, each spot at a $25 CPM is around $1,000. So those podcasters can bring in around $4,000 per episode. That's 4 ad spots at $1,000 per. Most podcasters release 4 times a month. So if you're doing around 40,000 downloads, you could pull in around 16 grand a month in podcast ads alone. So those are CPM based ads, and those are the main ads we book at Par, my company. And most brands aren't going to be as interested in booking those CPM based ads unless you have an audience of at least around 10,000 listeners per episode, which I know that's a lot, and that freaks people out when I say it, but it doesn't really count you out as far as the revenues go, because there's other ways to make money on the advertising front, including CPA deals, which are cost per acquisition. CPA's cost per acquisition. What that means is you're going to be compensated for that ad based on how many conversions you drive. I was talking about promo codes a bit earlier, and those types of ads. If somebody orders, or you have 20 listeners that order on promo code Anthony, you're going to receive 20 times whatever predetermined commission payout that you and the brand established upfront in front of the campaign. So CPM and CPA campaigns are totally different, but the ads sound the exact same. It's really just, is a brand kind of taking a chance on you, giving you an upfront guaranteed spin number, or are they going to extend an opportunity for you to go try and really sell their product and make money based on how many people spend money on a promo code? Just to wrap that question out, Influencer Bridge is a good resource for you to use to go find those CPA deals if your audience is less than 10,000 downloads. And I'll put
That's awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask about Influencer Bridge because you had brought that up in the similar conversation we'd had like this before. And yeah, that seems like a really great resource for some early stage funding, in particular for those CPA deals. And kind of the way you've described it, CPM is more like a brand paying you for that peace of mind share, whereas CPA is more like a commission. Is that how you'd put it, Anthony?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And most brands, they won't book those CPM based ads on smaller podcasts because the industry is so saturated that, there's over 2 million podcasts right now. And for those brand buying agents, those buying agencies, in order to really move the needle, they need to target like the largest audiences really with their time. Their time's limited, the resources are limited. So they're booking shows that are over 10,000 downloads for the most part. So.
Mm-hmm. And we have a few quick follow-up questions on this in the chat, in case you didn't see them. Just that Vanessa was asking, when you say 50,000 downloads, is that per episode over what period of time? So is that typically like a 30-day window?
Yeah, so 30 to 60 days. We like to just kind of estimate 45 days. And to come up with that number, we always date back maybe 3 months and review, call it 6 months worth of episodes. We come up with an average audience delivery from those old episodes to really give audience projections.
Okay.
50,000 downloads, that was just an example to really do the math on the CPM pricing model.
And Haley was asking if there is an industry standard cost for those CPA deals you had mentioned.
Yeah, the CPA deals, they're always going to vary depending on how much the product costs. So I like to go use MeUndies, which is kind of an underwear brand, versus Helix Sleep, which is a mattress brand. If you're able to sell a mattress, one conversion is going to move about $1,200, whereas underwear isn't going to cost much more than $50. At least I'm not, buying.
You don't spend $1,200 on underwear, Anthony.
Right. So the commission payout's always going to vary depending on how much product costs on average.
Is there maybe a standard percentage of what that that commission is? Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't really know about percentage averages, but I do know that the underwear example brand pays out around $20 per conversion, whereas the mattress sponsors, they'll pay out closer to $500 per conversion. So
Gotcha.
it's selling product at cost for the brands and spreading messaging, buying customers. They're not really going to turn profit on CPA deals.
Right. Well, and then you also have to, there's a sort of analysis the podcaster needs to do. Do you want to bet on more people buying more underwear, or like one person buying a mattress? Right. So yeah, all these deals, you definitely have to think them through. Cool. I think we had another question. Willow, I believe you had popped up a second ago.
Yeah, I had a question for Megan. First of all, this is really reassuring. I hadn't really looked into applying for grants because I assumed you had to be a nonprofit to do that. So the fiscal sponsor stuff is really heartening. But supposing some of us are so busy making our podcast that we don't have time to learn how to be good grant writers, if you wanted to hire a grant writer to apply for some of these kinds of things, to identify some good ones to apply for and then apply for them, what does that cost?
Yeah, so it's about 50 an hour. Generally, I feel like with grant writers in this age range and experience range, it could be a lot more for sure. But in this types of like arts and humanities realm, I would say about that price. And it's also like I charge hourly for my grant work. Like some people have asked, like, do you just get a percentage of their grant awards? But you spend so much time like researching and writing the grants, and also just like doing administrative, talking to the funder and checking in with the funding report and all these different things, that it just really makes sense to charge by the hour. And then grant applications like vary. Some applications might take 3 or 4 hours. Some might take 10. So it really depends. And I would say when you're starting to work with a new grant writer, it'll take more time in the beginning as they're learning your project and how to position that and how to storytell around your work. But yeah, and then for grant research, depends on the scope of the research that you want them to do. But it could be 5 to 10 hours if you're really specific, or if you're broader. And I generally like come up with a grant calendar at the beginning of the new year, or like at the end of Q4, and kind of have the whole year mapped out for my client. And it's generally busier in like the beginning of the year and the spring and the fall. So that's kind of when a lot of grant applications tend to be due. Yeah.
So basically it would only be financially feasible to hire a grant writer if you got some really big money from the grants. Like there would be no point to doing it if you're going for a grant that's a couple $1,000s.
Yeah, probably not. Like, and yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like with my grant client, like that's even though I've only received 27% of the grants I wrote last year, it's 60% of your income. So it was like $50,000. And the last 2 years have been really weird because she's an in-person performer, like she's doing in-person events. So a lot of the grants that we've won the last few years have been COVID relief and recovery, which would be different in the realm of podcasting. But yeah, it only really kind of makes sense when you're needing to bring in like larger sums of money, probably. And I just popped those resources in the chat too. And I do have some people who I was working with a documentary filmmaker for a bit of time, and she didn't have much of a budget, and she would just pay me to edit, basically, just to have like a second set of eyes on the application.
And so besides, you, Megan, where do we find a grant writer if we're looking to hire one? Like, let's say your slate's busy, because obviously we want to send all of our business to you if possible, but where would you, or what would you look for in a grant writer if we are looking to hire one?
That's a really good question. I feel like it would be helpful if they potentially lived in your state. to have more of an understanding of the opportunities there. So it just wouldn't take as much time to do some of that grant.
Is that because a lot of funding happens on a state level?
From in my experience, at least, yeah, like the
Okay.
Humanities Montana, the greater, even for my grant client, like she gets ArtsWA funding. That's like our statewide arts council. So I think either if they're region specific but also like if they work in documentary film or some adjacent kind of realm could be helpful. I would say probably working with someone who's a more emerging professional would be easier on your pocketbook. But yeah, I would also ask like, what grants have you received in the past? And then I would ask to look at applications. And because a lot of times it's really personal for artists when they're working with a grant writer, like they don't want you to insert your voice. They want to kind of mirror what their art and what their, their sense of expression. So you're kind of in a way, sometimes for some people, they're asking me to like mimic their voice in the writing. So to look at that, look at an application and see, do I like how they're writing or is it not really my style? And yeah, I don't know exactly, honestly, where to look though. Like, I don't know, Up or those, I've never really used those types of online services, but I would, excuse me, I would recommend like word of mouth as much as you could probably.
Mm-hmm. So maybe if you can ask, even like if you went to college, you could probably ask a professor you had a good relationship with or something to help you find a grant writer that they've worked with or something like that. But what I'm hearing is don't just go on Fiverr and get that person from Vietnam who's super cheap. Like get someone who is going to probably know more about your region and is worth what you're paying them, right?
Yeah. And, or like even looking up like for example, the Montana Nonprofit Association, like maybe they have, you reach out to them, maybe they know grant writers in the area, or reaching out to a local humanities council, like somebody who's in the realm of development who would just generally know like grant writers.
Cool. And Avery has posted in the chat AIR's directory of people who do grant writing. So I didn't even know that was a thing. Thank you, Avery. That's awesome. And yeah, another one from Samantha, opengrants.io. So if you're interested in grant funding, there's a few resources as well as the one Megan's put together, Google Drive folder in the chat. Do we have any other questions for our monetization people?
Megan, I wanted to ask you just about kind of the timeline of when you got your funding versus how production was going for your show. How did you decide when you had enough money, or how did that all work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it was like the spring of last year that I was applying for grants for my second season, which launched in the fall. So that was kind of like when a lot of the grants were due was in the springtime. And then I was looking out to like take a month off for the summer and then start producing again in the fall. So I created from another podcast producer friend this really helpful production calendar, and I have color coded like fundraising deadlines, like communication work that I need to do, like launching out a press release at the beginning of the season. And just like my grant report when that's due. So I keep track of like all of those things. But and I also launched the project when I was in grad school, so I didn't like have to make money on it at that point. And then it was helpful when I was applying for grants, like Rob was saying, where I had this backlog and I'm like, here, you can see that I know how to do it, and please fund me. Yeah.
Is there any chance you could share that production schedule?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to put that in the folder too. Yeah.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question for Anthony. How do you recommend podcasters get information about their audience, and what information do we need to be able to sell ads?
So most of the info we pull is from podcast hosting platforms like Megaphone or Libsyn, Anchor. A lot of the hosting platforms will tell you demographic information about your audience. The most important metrics are age and gender demos. So those will be requested by mostly really it's every client that spends money. They want to know the average age and average gender of the audience. It definitely affects what clients will be interested and will want to move forward with, with your podcast. Many hosting platforms don't provide that info, but the best ones do. We always recommend Megaphone. They just provide the most information, and they have some additional sales capabilities for your historical episodes. So there's additional ways to monetize outside of you offering ads yourselves. They'll actually inject ads on your back catalogs, and you can make money that can cover the cost of hosting simply by hosting on their platform. So demographic info mostly comes from hosting platforms. If you're on a platform that doesn't have that info, we sometimes use social accounts, like an Instagram business account, I believe, will show the same type of audience metrics. When we do that, we simply say that it's an estimate, because you're not going to always have the same audience that follows you on socials that is also listening to the show. Actually, social demographics tend to be lower in age. So you have to take that into consideration when using estimates.
And Anthony, I'll just jump in to add, I think it's important to note that unlike a lot of other platforms and media, podcasting, it's changing, yes, but podcasting is still very much a Wild West compared to like YouTube, where on YouTube you have an account where you put in all that demographic information and it is reported back on one platform, versus like if you are hosting your podcast on Megaphone and it's going out to a bunch of different platforms, the data, everyone reports differently. So anyhow, point being, we as podcasters do not have nearly as granular data as some other media might. I think that's changing, but advertisers need to be aware of that as well if you're trying to sell them an ad, correct? That's not like a one-to-one report.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely a bit of, you can only do your best when you're pitching content. You provide the information you have on hand. If you don't have really information directly from a platform, or you don't know the exact number, it's just important to mention these are estimates, or you have a pretty good idea. And if you don't have any demographic info, sometimes we even come up with like the target P1. So who do I think is like my podcast is targeting? Like somebody in the Bible, female, a mother in the Bible Belt between the age of 30 and 40 years old with kids. We like to paint a picture for who the target listener is, and that really helps get deals done and sell media.
Yeah, stereotyping is not always the nicest thing to do, but it's also a realistic thing to do when you're trying to sell ads. And yeah, that woman in the Bible Belt with kids that you just mentioned is probably not the best person to try to sell, like, I'm struggling to think of a product, but yes, like you're not going to sell the same products to that audience as you are to Joe Rogan's audience or to whatever. There's the right fit for the right audience, and podcasters and advertisers both need to consider that when looking for each other. Cool. Well, we're getting towards the end of the meeting, so I want to make sure that we can address any other questions that people have. I have dropped my contact information in the chat, and we'll do so again. If anyone wants to follow up, feel free to reach out to me via email or book an appointment with me or whatever. I'm always happy to talk and answer questions and be of help if I can. Are there any other questions that we have for our speakers?
I had one more for Megan. You had mentioned something really interesting about, you've been doing this for a while, so you've gotten pretty good at understanding, the grants you're probably, have a good likelihood of getting. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit more. How can you tell which grants you have a better likelihood of getting over others?
Yeah, I guess some of the grants are just so big, like that my client goes after, like Creative Capital, which is this award that goes to artists around the country. And so in comparison to some of the larger grants that she goes after, and she's a much more established artist than I am too. I just kind of, I like shy away from those right now because I'm like, I don't think I'm going to get that, and it's going to take me a long time to apply. And then I guess I'm from Montana, and I have relationships with some of these foundations, kind of like I'm contracting with Humanities Montana right now, helping with communications needs. And that happened after I got the grant from them. So there wasn't a conflict of interest there. I actually explored that with them too. But I've met some of these people and just kind of have a more finger on the pulse that they will likely fund me. And yeah, like for the Greater Montana Foundation, that was a connection that I had previously made through the foundation. And so in applying, I was like, okay, I think I have a pretty good chance. Yeah, I guess it's hard to gauge, but I would say the more local you get, the more likely you'll probably get the award. And so like starting with like to see what grants are available at a county level, if that's something that your county offers, and then state level, and then kind of branching out from there.
Have you looked into becoming a nonprofit yourself, like turning your podcast into a nonprofit? Would it be worth it?
Well,
to deal with a fiscal sponsor and all that?
It would probably be more work because then I'd have a board oversight and just more checks and balances in that way. And I kind of like staying more nimble and being like more of a sole proprietor. But yeah, so also when you work with a fiscal sponsor, they take a percentage of your awards. So that's like one downside, but in a way I'm like, it's cool. I'm helping out the Montana History Foundation, but they can take up from like 7 to 12% or kind of what I hear. And my fiscal sponsor takes 10%. I don't think it would make sense for me right now. And also, yeah, just because I would want to like be settled in Montana when I would want to become a nonprofit, but some people just stay a fiscal sponsor, and my client right now is looking into becoming a nonprofit because it would make more sense for her, and the amount of like fiscal sponsor fees that they take from her grant awards are just like annoying. So yeah.
I had some questions if we have time for more.
Yeah, let's go ahead. We'll close out on this question.
Okay. Well, thank you also for hosting this. It's just super helpful for me because I'm like at a crossroads right now. I'm trying to figure out where to take my podcast, whether like with grant, right, or for ads, or going independent and setting up an LLC. So this was really, really helpful. I guess I'll ask my LLC question to you, Rob. I have more than one podcast, and I'm not sure, exactly how I'm going to proceed with them. Are there like anything I should avoid doing when I'm setting up an LLC that's going to like box me into something in the future, or is it really open-ended and it's just a paperwork thing?
So prefacing all of this with, I am not an attorney. I was advised by an attorney, and that's the first step I would do, is find someone who's in your state. Don't just go to LegalZoom or whatever, but find someone who is in your state and knows the legal ins and outs of how business work in your state, and really talk to them. Usually that would kind of be covered in a free consulting thing. But as I understand it, being in an LLC actually gives you like more flexibility than most other forms of business entity, like a corporation. But the main reason I was encouraged to do an LLC versus a sole proprietorship, which I saw someone mention in the chat, was just mainly for tax purposes. So that's because I freelance and I go out and receive money for work I do for other people. A big reason is, one, the expenses I have on my end. So once again, things like any equipment that I buy for the job is a tax write-off. It's not just coming straight out of my bank account. And it's also makes, all that tax paperwork with my clients a lot easier. So instead of sending out my social security number and a bunch of information to all my various clients who may or may not have the best, security practices in place or most trustworthy people or whatever. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love my clients, but just the reality of the situation, you're able to get what's called an EIN, or an employer identification number. And that will allow you to report your income to the IRS without it being like you having to send your personal individual tax information to a bunch of people. So it's just to kind of make the tax stuff easier and your finance stuff easier, so that again, if you're doing something, I see Willow here is mentioning the EIN for sole proprietorship too. It may be that I'm in Texas, so I'm really not sure. And as I've said, I'm not an attorney. So yeah, my advice to you is really to get out and talk to an attorney about the LLC question. But in my experience, that's what I've been told to do.
And I set up an LLC without reaching out to an attorney. But I think that is really a safe bet. And I also put a couple links to SCORE and the SBA. So SCORE provides like free business counseling. So you could also like reach out to one of those kind of organizations, or like a local economic development council or something, and seek their advice about setting it up in your state too. And I had to set it up for like a city too. So I had to set up like a LLC and then like become a registered business in the city. So there might be different criteria depending on where you live.
Yeah, I think because business formation is typically handled at the state level, it is going to differ from state to state. And that's why it's, yeah, definitely good to talk to someone in your state who knows the ins and outs. But SCORE, as Megan shared, and I believe Willow had also mentioned, SCORE is a great resource. One last thing I'll add on the LLC note versus sole proprietorship that may kind of help, besides the tax thing, is also that very key word, limited liability. Meaning, as it was explained to me, if you're a sole proprietor and for whatever reason one of my clients came after me, they could technically come after me for everything I own. Whereas with an LLC, they can only come after me for what the LLC owns. So if I were a sole proprietor and a court determined I did, $1 million in damage to my client, then I, as an individual, as Rob Upchurch, would owe my client $1 million. With an LLC, I don't owe them $1 million. The LLC does. And then that's how all that financial stuff works out, and bankruptcy and everything. So that's another consideration, again, with LLCs. But again, my business is more serving others, whereas Vanessa, it does sound like you're talking more about your own personal podcast. So I think it really depends on your situation. Quick questions we might have, or can I kind of wrap it up? All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we have time for today, but I appreciate everyone for coming and asking great questions. And I mean, I've definitely learned things from sitting here. I hope everyone enjoyed it. If you are not on our email or our Google group, ruralradiocollective@gmail.com, just send an email to ruralradiocollective@gmail.com and we will make sure to add you to that email list. It is not a lot of emails at all, so don't worry about spam or anything. And that's where you'll be able to see upcoming information about our next meeting, which will pertain to communicating healthcare in rural settings. So hope to see everyone then and there. And please get in touch with me or any of our other speakers if you have any other questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.